Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I am co-host number two, Terry Barnes. And as always, we are the art and science of the Viking Age. So today we have a guest that I heard speak, when was that? In February, I guess, eh? At a small group that I belong to that was started by one of my former students. And it's a little Viking enthusiast group, I guess we would call it. But anyway, I was a guest speaker the month before, and then our guest today was the guest in February, and it was very interesting. So I'm like, hey, come talk to us on Vikingology. So we have all the way from Yorkshire, Alex Harvey, who is an archaeologist. And oh boy, I have some interesting questions to ask you too about archaeology. And he is the author of a lot of books about the medieval period, including a new one that's going to be coming out, so not available yet, called Little Kingdoms: An A to Z of Early Medieval Britain. But we wanted to talk to him about his other book called Forgotten Vikings, which also, unfortunately, here in the US is not out yet until a little bit later this month. But still, we wanted to be able to talk to him about that. And you're also, this is something else I want to ask you about. You're a collections manager for, what is it, Pocklington District Heritage Trust, which sounds
That's
very
the one.
interesting. Yeah, and then secretary for the Yorkshire Archaeological and Historical Society. So that's cool because a lot of public history as well, which I think is important because we don't like to be, well, no offense to anybody out there, but we don't want to be stuck up academics. We want to make sure that people get access to this history because it's so
Yeah.
interesting. So anyway,
Offense taken, Terry. Offense taken.
sorry, man.
Says the least academic person in this group.
Well, welcome, Alex Harvey, to Vikingology.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to many scintillating and hopefully entertaining chats with both of you today about all things Viking Age and maybe the periods just before and after.
Whoa, whoa,
So,
Alex. Our audience is mostly in the US. Let's keep the vocab to fifth grade, okay? I'm kidding.
oh man.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I had to dig. I had
Ah.
to dig. I'm moving to France, so they can't get me.
Oh, well, so actually, do you have, since we don't have ours yet, do you have a copy of your Forgotten Vikings you
Do,
can hold up? And
Ooh.
we'll link to it in the show notes so people can order it.
dramatically
Um,
reveal.
woo. Did
Oh,
you
yeah, and
decide
it,
on the cover art or did the publisher?
Well, I did all of the illustrations actually. So
Nice.
this is based on a genuine archaeological find from Sweden just at the dawn of the 7th century, so pre-Viking age.
Yeah.
But it's a recognizable symbol. This little guy in various forms. We call him the weapon dancer. It appears on Sutton Hoo helmet, the fragments of the Staffordshire Hoard helmet, both from Britain, but also examples in Denmark. Recently, they discovered a small picture plate about that big, depicting a similar figure but on a horse. So it's like a representation of Odin sometimes because the eye is blotted out, like so.
Yeah.
And
so
then there
fun
are,
fact. Oh, keep
please,
going.
please.
I was gonna say, fun fact about that little figure is I have an article on my website about arguing whether or not the Vikings wore helmets at all.
Yeah,
And I do start with, oh, but they didn't have horns on their helmets. And then invariably there are internet warriors, keyboard warriors who come in and they will post their evidence for why the Vikings did have horns on their helmets. And it's always
yeah,
that guy.
yeah. It's like it's difficult to ascertain the difference between a piece of art from the Viking Age that depicts horns and then gauging that alongside the belief in horned helmets. It's one thing to draw someone with horns, it's another thing to say they all wore horned helmets.
Good, right. Debunk the myth, Alex. Just
We've
Debunk
throw
got
it.
it
to.
out.
We've got to. There are all sorts of drawings in this book. I did most of them. Well, all of them in essence. There's a boat.
Oh, nice. That's nice.
Wow.
So
A
yeah,
writer and an artist. See, the art and science of the Viking Age. You are
Yes,
our ideal guest.
in our
I don't
wheelhouse.
know about the science, but it's certainly the art and writing.
Well, what is a forgotten Viking?
So, well, the impetus behind the book, kind of the thrust that compelled me to write it, is it's a very popular topic, the Viking Age, especially in the UK. There are so many books written about it, and they all follow a tried and tested narrative of kind of an increase in scale. They start more or less with the Lindisfarne raid of 793, and then ramp up and up and up until the Great Heathen Army invades in 865, and then kind of a little bit of stagnation, the changing in England, then Canute the Great's invasion in the 11th century. But to me, the reason these books are always framed in that way, and it's not necessarily a bad way to write a history book, is because we're so used to seeing the Viking Age as starting in 793 and ending in 1066. And what I wanted to do, having learned much from great scholars like Steve Ashby, Dawn Hadley, Neil Price, just to name three off the top of my head, was to start a book on the phenomenon of the Vikings from a much earlier point of time, which for me is kind of the tail end of the Roman period into the 6th century, when you start to see an accumulation of archaeological evidence that pushes us towards what we'd consider the classic Viking Age. And one thing I always stress in my lectures, regardless of the subject matter really, is that people living through a historical period don't know they're in a historical period. To them, it's just life. Like today, we're in present day. No one woke up, on the 8th of June, 793,
Yeah.
checked their watch and thought, ah, Viking Age, thank God, finally. Um, and the same goes for the end of 1066, the day after Harold Hardrada was killed. No one woke up in England and said, thank God the Viking Age is over. Yeah, so it was about kind of the forgotten element there is that we forget broad themes like that historical periods aren't neatly defined. And then in each chapter, because there's 10 chapters, I wanted to bring at least one major element of either history, historiography, archaeology to the forefront. Sometimes it's the central argument of that chapter. Other times it's kind of a veneer or a new framing of arguments that people might already be familiar with. So kind of early raids on Ireland, the boom in the slave trade in the 10th century, but done from different perspectives using different objects, many of which are relegated to the vaults of museums, forgotten museums, one could say. So it was a fun book to write. It was kind of the synthesis of my maybe about 8 years of my own study in the University of York and then afterwards.
I'm very looking forward to reading this then because I didn't know that specifically. And that's exactly what I'm working on right now as well. I mean, there's other elements to it, but I agree with you. I think that they were poised to do what becomes sort of the Viking phenomenon much earlier
Yeah.
than it has been mostly put forward by people in England who like
Yes, the
793,
Anglo-centric view.
which we've talked about, right, CJ, a million
Yeah.
times on this podcast
Yeah.
of like,
I,
um,
I saw a reel that was making fun of the delineation, right? It's like a super history nerd reel that only, probably me. I was probably the only person who liked that reel. But they had taken the siege of Minas Tirith in the Lord of the Rings, and they have that section where, or the scene with the orc that was supposed to look like Harvey Weinstein.
Oh
And
yeah.
he says, over is the age of man, and now is the time of the orc, right? And they replaced the age of man with the Anglo-Saxons, and then they said the age of, and then they said and then now comes the Viking age,
Yeah.
like all of
Yeah.
a sudden we show up and we're starting the Viking age. I thought that was
that's a hard one to kill like the helmets though, a little bit, I have to say, because like literally yesterday we just started our spring quarter here at the college where I teach, and I was grading some of the reading responses that my students had to do to, James Barrett's famous, what caused the Viking Age
Yeah.
article. And that was literally a question. They have to read it and then come up with a question that they have. And it was like, do you think those people knew that they were, creating a Viking Age? And it's kind of like, no, like I didn't even know them. And I could pretty much say no, like, for the reasons you just said, we all just sort of live in our moment, but we don't know what the context of that is really, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, they have no way of knowing that in 1200 years we'll all be sitting here yakking about them on the internet.
Oh, well, no,
Talking-
if only. But I
Yeah.
mean that's a fascinating point. One of the kind of hopefully cogent arguments in the third chapter relates to kind of the motivations for raiding. So that James Barrett article is a brilliant related point here. And Steve Ashby published one very similar on kind of the thrust of the Viking Age, what caused or what inspired people to go Viking to begin
Social
with.
capital, man. The
That's
desire.
it. Well, it's, some of it's mundane. It's like wealth, portable wealth. Others, some of the other reasons is about reputation
Right.
and enhancing reputation and being remembered. So I think quite a lot of the big names of the Viking Age, some real, some pseudo legendary, we don't know the case for all of them. We'll be very happy that we're
Oh
still
yeah.
yapping about them on a
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah, yeah, I
Uh,
agree with
you
you.
know,
Yeah, that's definitely like my parting email to my students every at the end of every term is that these people lived to be remembered, so they would be very thankful that we're sitting here keeping their memory alive. So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, right about that.
I totally don't write about a character who's obsessed with being remembered.
Yeah, right.
And he's a real guy, Hastings, right? And so can you imagine this guy hearing that, oh, you wrote a whole book like first of all, he'd be like, what's a book? And then you wrote a whole book series about me, and then I'd tell him what I did, and then he'd be like, that totally isn't actually what happened, but sure. And he'd be thrilled.
No,
You're like, well,
absolutely.
if you would have written it down, Hastings, then I would have known what have happened. Duh, like, right? Like,
I couldn't
Well,
even write runes.
yeah.
the
Ah,
injection of myth and fact into some of the sagas, Ingvar's saga is a brilliant example. It's just so entertaining from its own perspective. You read them, and on one hand, you've got semi-accurate description of a Swedish dynast traveling along the river routes through modern Ukraine all the way down to the Caspian Sea. But then, on the other hand, interspersed with this probably real account or second, third hand, is mentions of dragons, massive ravines that like the sun doesn't shine in, floating cities. And that's one example. There are other sagas that intersperse the mythological or the cosmological in with the real. And I think a lot of the case, it's for the audiences at least, it probably didn't matter that they wouldn't have been listening in a mead hall, perhaps in Iceland, and they wouldn't have thought, all right, we've ended the real bit now. Okay, this is a section on trolls. Then we'll go back to the real bit. It would have just been equally entertaining, all of it, all the way through. These themes fused together.
yeah.
So it's a brilliant parallel, what you just brought up, CJ.
See, you could have lived in the Viking Age, CJ.
No, no. We've talked about this. I like
Perfect.
dentists and doctors and clean water,
Antibiotics.
hot
Mm.
showers. No, thank you. It's fun to look at. It's like going to a museum. Ooh, this is pretty. This is nice, but don't put me in it.
No,
Yeah.
that thing is-
I
yeah.
watched The Northman again like a week or so ago, just like fodder on the treadmill. And sometimes I have to say, like, when you read about this stuff enough, like, doing research and it's just like words on a page, words on a page, words on a page. Sometimes, even though it's like, TV, movie, whatever, modern interpretation and all of that, it's like, I like to watch these things because I like the visual, right? I
Mm.
like, and there is a way of sort of feeling a little bit more immersed and yeah, it seems like a little bit rough to like, especially that game in Natlaker they play where they're just
Oh
Mm.
yeah, when they cave
beating
someone's
the
head in
hell out of each
with the
other with
bat.
these
Yeah.
bats and like, oh my God. It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
boys will be boys, I
I,
suppose.
I
It's a
refer
brilliant film. I
I,
love
I
that film.
I refer to that movie as the Tropic Thunder of Viking films now because the argument that I make, because I write fiction
Yeah.
and historical fiction. Now I tend to write as close to real history as possible. I use real events, real people, that sort of thing. Uh, so I don't lean into the fantasy piece like a lot of other authors do. Try to keep it as historical as possible because I am trying to educate while I'm entertaining. However, there is an acknowledgement that modern audiences are not going to identify with like a real Viking and a person today would be so culturally, linguistically separated that they wouldn't. So readers won't identify with a real Viking. I have to make my Viking a 21st century Viking in order for readers to identify with him for the archetypes of his behavior and thinking and motivations to match. Otherwise, I'm not writing a good story for a modern audience. What I love about the Northmen is they basically said, "Screw that, let's just go full Viking," and that's where in Tropic Thunder they say, "Never go full." Well, can I say that anymore? I can't.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
no, never go full R beep. And then and so I say and Northman was at the box office a flop, and I say that's because never
Yeah.
go full Viking.
Yeah, people are like, I don't get it. Like, I don't,
Never,
I don't.
you never go full Viking.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it's more or less a movie adaptation straight of your classic saga. Like there's no real character journey for the protagonist. At the start of the film, he's like, I will avenge you, father. I will save you, mother. I will kill you, Fjolnir. Then at the end of the film, kills Fjolnir. There's no like moment where he's like, maybe I shouldn't be a blood-hungry revenge machine. I know Anya Taylor-Joy's character,
Yeah,
there's an element of trying to convince him otherwise, but he
right.
comes to the conclusion, no, I must slay my enemy.
Yeah.
I will not be satisfied till the edge of my blade drips with his blood.
No, the first time
You
you
know,
what?
modern audiences are just like, oh,
Whatever.
what?
No, you know what I saw? Like, and I've seen it before, but then I'm watching it again, and then like as soon as the evil uncle shows up, who also, of course, has dark hair, in contrast to the like whatever, darker blonde or lighter hair. Anyway, I was like, that's Scar, and I'm watching The Lion King right now.
Yeah.
So, it's pretty much the same story all the way through. Poor little Simba now has to swear vengeance the whole time. And lo and behold, he gets it.
Well, The Lion King was based off of Hamlet. It was
I
Disney's,
know,
yeah.
I
So
know. But
and
it's like,
and
okay,
Hamlet was based off of Amleth, right? Wasn't
It
that?
was, yeah. It's
you just moved
the pipeline, I think, of these Old Norse heroic figures like Arvandil the Swift, who's in a I forgot this specific tale, but he's connected to a myth about Thor. They're crossing an ice river in either Niflheim or Hell, and Arvandil's foot or toe is caught in the river. So to save him, Thor snaps off his frostbitten toe and lobs it into the sky, and it becomes a star. But this character, Arvandil the Swift, his name is kind of revitalized a few times in different forms in charters and in assembly registers in 8th and 9th century Bavaria in Germany, one of the Carolingian duchies at the time. And then later in 12th century Denmark, a chap called Saxo Grammaticus takes the name and he becomes the father of Amlethus, like you just said. And then Shakespeare is like, oh, this is good. Hamlet, I'll have that.
move the H.
And then the Lion King takes it and goes, oh, I like that. I love that. And then finally we're back full circle with the Northman.
Well,
It's
that's
a
what because
circle of
CJ like
Vikings.
yeah. Well, and plus too, CJ, like you and I talk about all the time, or at least I definitely go on about with other people as well. It's like human beings are only capable of about like five responses to things. We only
Yeah.
tell five stories. We've got the hero's journey. What else? I don't know. So we're pretty limited in our range.
Rags to riches
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like
narrative.
seven plot
Love
lines.
triangles.
Yeah.
Good old Lax de la Saga. Get a good love triangle.
It's my editor has a great worksheet for figuring, for identifying if you have any plot holes. And it has a giant warning at the top. And it says, if your story deviates from this structure in any way, you need to ask yourself, is your story so unique and special that it can stand on its own outside of, like it has a nice disclaimer basically saying like, just use this structure. Like don't go out of it.
You want to sell books, right?
Yeah.
Don't go too crazy.
Yeah. Well, why are you interested in Vikings to begin with?
Big question. It'll prompt a big answer. So, I think I got into the Viking Age, or at least the aesthetic and the idea of the Viking Age, when I was around 14, 15 years old. Initially, I think, defining moment was seeing the first episode of The Last Kingdom on TV in 2015, I believe. I believe it was. It was on BBC One. It was BBC distributed at the time. I know later Netflix took over. And I watched that with my mum and dad one evening after school. And there was something about just that perfect mix of acting, costume, set design, music, visuals. The budget was just right. It wasn't too flashy, but it also didn't look cheap. And the pacing across those 8 episodes in season one is sublime. I think that first season is absolutely brilliant. Say what you will about the accuracy, say what you will about the costumes. For me, it served as a brilliant prelude for me then asking my dad and asking my mum for Viking books at Christmas. Um, Later down the line, a couple of years after that, my interest in the Vikings went from, oh, I really like Vikings, yeah, to I want to study about these guys. And then you start to, like many people, I imagine, realize that a lot of the things that are entertaining about these shows, The Last Kingdom, Vikings on Amazon Prime, um, that a lot of it's wrong. Sometimes it's like a flubbed fact here or there. Some other times, especially in the case of Vikings, it's just complete fairy tale nonsense with an aesthetic of the Viking Age, or at least kind of a heavy metal, grungy idea of what the Viking Age is. Everyone's in boiled leather, it's grey all the time. All people talk about is Odin and killing one another and blood feuds. But it's interesting. It certainly appealed to my teenage mind, and I was like, oh, this is sick. So then I went to study it in books and so on. And when I was doing my final year of college, so in the UK, that's the final year of A levels, which is what you do before going to university. I'm not quite sure what the equivalent is in the US, but the stage before university slash college. And I was allowed to pick my own coursework. So we had two exams that were on preset topics, the Reconquista in Spain, that was really interesting, and the British Civil War as well. But the coursework, I thought, wow, I can do anything. Some people I know did kind of samurai, World War One, World War Two, and I was firmly set on the Viking Age. I knew I wanted to the minute I chose to study history as an A level. And in taking that coursework, it allowed me to dive into textual sources for the first time. So, first time reading primary stuff like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And it was the first time kind of understanding, and again, I was only a teenager at the time, that you can't read text like that as just what it says is what happened. There's biases to understand, and the biases is what makes a textual source interesting. It's never what it says, it's why people have said that or why people have written it down. Um, and then eventually, to cut a long saga short, I went on to study archaeology at the University of York because I do remember reading to some degree the different course contents between history and archaeology. And the archaeology, at least at the undergrad level, offered a much broader span of time. And I knew a few years into the course I'd be able to specialize in the Viking Age. There were modules led by, like I mentioned earlier, Dawn Hadley and Steve Ashby that I really wanted to take. And over the course of the undergraduate, I learned how to write essays better, applying different disciplines to bolster arguments and so on. And then my dissertation was on the Viking Age, Viking armies in Frisia, which form a huge chapter in Forgotten Vikings. I think to understand and reapproach the narrative of the ninth century Great Heathen Army of England, we have to understand Frisia and what's going on there, which is the modern Netherlands. That was my undergrad dissertation. I loved it so much, I wanted to do a larger thesis, which prompted me to take my master's also at the University of York. And since then, I've worked across numerous museums in Yorkshire. That's more or less what I do now, alongside the writing of books, because no one ever knows everything. And I love learning. And then I love disseminating that knowledge in entertaining bite-size, different formats. Sometimes that's illustrations, sometimes that's books, sometimes that's lectures. In this case, it's a fun podcast. So yeah, the little shows like that, to be honest, Last Kingdom is what got me into it, which is why I'll never, we can harp on about their accuracy and we can critique writing decisions, but people get into history through entertainment like that, and it should never be disparaged, in my opinion. It plays a very important role in inspiring young people to get interested in history and archaeology. And for that, I have a huge thanks to the team who made The Last Kingdom and Vikings. Whatever we can say about, some aspects of the quality and the accuracy. So yeah, big answer for a
Yeah.
big question.
No, it's
I,
great. It's great.
I think that's great. That's why I started writing books. I remember when I wrote my first novel, people said, "Why'd you write your first novel?" Because I was teaching at the time. I taught school, and I just said, I want to provide an entertaining venue for kids to get to engage with history. And I said, the best thing that could ever happen to me is, oh gosh, this is what I used to say back then. And now we are in that time. If somebody comes back to me 10 years from now and gets a PhD in history and says, hey, I got into this because I read your book and I just want to tell you, you were wrong here, here, and here. Mission accomplished, my friend.
Yeah, that's it,
I
isn't it?
did it.
Yeah.
I did it. If one person does that, they haven't come to me yet. But
This is,
yeah.
yeah, please, Karen.
Oh yeah. The only thing is more recently, and I do have an article. I think I did a video for YouTube too for this, talking about the specifically the show Vikings that went into full fantasy, and
Yeah.
the way they were promoting it as history. And we have studies from several universities that show when students are exposed to historical fiction in film or books or whatever, and there are falsehoods in there that are more mythology based, etc., kind of made up. The students tend to remember those things that were false better than the things that were true.
Mm.
And so for me, that means that we need, as an entertainer, I need to be meticulous in how I present the information at the end. Basically, say, here's the story. I hope you had fun. But at the end of the story, say, here's where it's true, and here's what you should remember. I totally made up, and I acknowledge where I deviated from real history. So, like in my most recent book, the historical notes is, I think, 15% of the book, just because at the very end, because it's just I meticulously tear apart my own work just to make sure everybody understands that I made most of it up. It's fiction, but here's the real
Yeah.
history that you can then explore, and here's some resources that you can access. And I think if we all did that, that would help folks along because I think there is some damage being done, specifically because I think with the Viking Age, we can get away with it. It was a long time ago. Nobody cares, right? The president of the United States isn't going to read a Viking book and then make some silly mistake and, start a trade war, but he can read a fictitious book about, you know, uh, Andrew Jackson, I think, who did. I'm sorry to bring current events into this, but it pissed me off. Trump doesn't read, but his cabinet guy who came up with the tariffs could have read something about 1828 and picked up all the falsehoods and goes, "Yes, tariffs are good." Now he's wrecking the world, right? So the real damage could be done through this medium if we're not careful, and I think an acknowledgement of that is necessary.
No,
I,
absolutely. You're bang on.
yeah, so I think also, though, um, because this is something I've written about and given public talks about, I think there's only so far that we can go. And there's like several examples of it, right? I mean, people for one thing, people don't understand in general, unless you're geeky historians like us, that people throughout history have recorded histories for different reasons, not
Yeah.
like, looking for objective truths like we do now, intend to usually. And so, people have been playing fast and loose with the facts like forever, and they're doing it for a reason because they want the history that they want. And so, like one of the things with my students learning about, the co-opting by, white supremacists and such for, Nordic history and stuff. And then they're always like, well, why don't you just teach them the real history? And it's like, we can, but largely probably because that crowd doesn't really care about what the real history is. And so, and they also have a very big sort of, disdain for academics and think that the academics are the ones sort of playing fast and loose with the facts and stuff. And then I had students who, like from the beginning of teaching this class, like they would read, I'm sure like, Roberta Frank's article about debunking the blood eagle, right?
Yeah.
And yet still like, yeah, I don't care. I'm still want to think that they did it because it's cool and
Oh man, the
whatever
Blood Eagle
so
thing.
there's only
Oh
it's we can do what we can do, but otherwise people are still people at the end of the day, and they sort
yeah.
of cherry pick the past. We've always done it, and we always will do it.
History repeats. Hey, that's
Yeah.
what they say. With the Roberta Frank article is brilliant. I mean, that comes up in mine. There's a whole section on the Blood Eagle, different theories,
Yeah.
what it may or may not mean. I was entertained once. I can't remember when. It was on a Facebook thread. It was a science paper, I think, that had come out that said technically it's possible to do the Blood Eagle on
That was
someone.
only like a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that it was all over in the various kind of Dark Age Britain Facebook groups that I'm in, in all caps, and people saying finally the Blood Eagle's been proved. And there was arguments. I don't think I got involved because it's fun enough just reading, to be honest. Um, and people saying, yeah, I knew they'd do it. Obviously, it's so obvious they'd do the Blood Eagle. We have references to it. But proving that it can be done and not kill someone in the process doesn't mean it was. Um,
Yeah.
like the Roberta Frank article says, there are so many ways to read the kennings where you mention Blood Eagle or
Yeah.
Raven of Blood, any sort of metaphor.
Yeah.
And the conversation about what it means is so much more interesting than just saying, oh, it's a specific torture method where we rip out the lungs to look like an eagle. That to me is the most boring explanation. It makes little sense to me as well because
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it just doesn't add up as well as the other arguments, like it means someone face down in a battlefield, or it's a
Yeah.
grandiose way of suggesting a mass slaughter.
Yeah. Well, and for those of our listeners who probably definitely some people will certainly know, we're like saying Roberta Frank, like as everybody knows, because we're in this sort of little nerd circle here. But yeah, Roberta Frank is a scholar who wrote an article like in the 1980s. So this has been a long time already, talking about this blood eagle torture. And she was a specialist in looking at like the poetry and such, and looked at it over the course of a long period of time and came down with the conclusion that the blood eagle, even if it ever existed, certainly wasn't as gruesome as what we think about it now in modern popular culture because, the cliched Viking telephone game ensued in the centuries between now and the Viking Age. And for every succeeding century, it gets worse and bloodier and, more gruesome and all of that. But that I like it that towards the end of the article where she says it was likely the bird that never was.
Yeah,
It's all just down to sort of misinterpretation, like you say, in the kennings, these little devices in the poetry of the age and stuff that like you had to know, to be
yeah,
really to understand it fully. And so it's easy to get misinterpreted over time and then just sort of pass that on into the future.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that paper is a brilliant example where a really important piece of work has become embedded in scholarly thought and it's pushed the discipline forward. And, we all wish that we will write something like that one day. Um, I'm not at all saying um, none of us can ever reach that level, but it's about kind of appreciating scholarly developments like that and tying it into your own work. Because collectively, as we've been discussing, I think archaeologists and historians, linguists, all of the other disciplines, we have a duty to always challenge and reapproach even very popular topics of history because there are always new ways to discuss things, and that was one of the thrusts of my book. I mean, the subtitle is New Approaches to the Viking Age. Now, they might not all be new to everyone, especially more nerdy circles like ourselves. We might read it and go, oh, I've heard this before. But for the average audience,
Sure.
if I was to look at myself 8 years ago, I would have picked this book up and I wouldn't have known any of it because this kind of some arguments aren't in the popular history books, kind of like the Roberta Frank um, scholarly development on the Blood Eagle that isn't making the headlines in history books as much as a grisly torture method when we rip out people's rib cages would. So one of the things that's been really, really lovely to see, albeit on a small scale, is the reception to my book. It's been out 6 months in the UK now, and it's been cited already in Annie Whitehead's new book, which is on murder in early medieval Britain, so law codes and so on. And it was nice to get a citation there. That's my first time, a book's been cited in someone else's book. And a colleague of mine really kindly sent me a screenshot of one of his undergrad's articles or essays, and they had cited my name in the paper. And I thought, oh my God, that is absolutely brilliant because I was in their shoes 6, 7 years ago, citing people I read. And it's so nice to see that full circle moment.
Yeah,
The
totally.
development of a scholar to or a reader to a writer, and then the cycle continues. It's just wonderful to see, and I hope that as I was inspired by the books in the Viking Age I read, like Thomas Williams' Viking Britain, my book inspires other people to write their own. Like you said, CJ, if one day someone was to come to me and say, your book got a lot wrong, so I wrote this one. Great, because we're continuing that discussion. We're making new approaches to a tried and tested topic. So yeah, I mean, I love that. I long for that stuff. Brilliant.
Yeah, because the new approach is, what's new in the new approach is you. you're a unique individual, right? And so, I mean, because what is it? Look at it seriously, other than if it's something like brand new, like, ooh, new science that came out or whatever that nobody had access to use anyway. We're all
Yeah.
just trotting over the same sources anyways.
Yeah.
But each of us brings some new kind of lens that's unique to ourselves to it and sees something maybe a little bit different in it. And so then it, forges a new interpretation. And that's this the name
Yeah.
of the game,
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Well, I think that transitions well to a question I have about your book, Alex. Terry and I have discussed, actually, this is how we met, was comparing articles on what started the Viking Age. And from that, just asking that question alone presumes that there was a beginning to a so-called Viking Age. However, in reading the materials that I accessed online about your book and some of the lectures that you've done and some of the talks you've given, it seems you have a different approach to this in terms of the ambiguity around both the genesis of and conclusion of our so-called Viking Age. Could you enlighten us? I want to hear more about the beginning. The end I get because it's like it trails off and it's like, oh well, then they Christianized and you don't have Vikings anymore. But then the Kingdom of Denmark went on crusade and it's like that sounds really Viking to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're bang on. The thing about the end of the Viking Age, and I will circle back to the beginning, is that the end of the Viking Age for me is characterized by the world kind of, I don't know, it as more of the world becomes explored, there are less spots on the map to go Viking. That's one of the lines from the final chapter of my book. Um, there's in the start of the Viking Age, if we're to kind of follow the usual timeline, Scandinavia's, at least in textual sources from the UK, from the continent, it's relegated to kind of a nebulous north. It's understood to be geographically north, yes, but also spiritually. It's associated with the cold, unending winter. So folk who come from the north and they go Viking, they're wrapped up in this milieu of mystery. And as more of the world is explored, part of that is much later Columbus discovering the New World, um, the expansion of African trade routes, and so on. There are less spots on the map that are blurry at this point. You get the greater consolidation of, I suppose, proto-nation states, to use the briefest possible piece of terminology. So you get a case where it's no longer about a nebulous north emerging like a bolt from the blue to raid organized kingdoms on its periphery, but it's more just about organized kingdoms going to war against one another until there are no um, nebulous areas left. It kind of dwindles, like you say, around the Baltic area, moving into the 13th, 14th centuries. And I suppose that process in reverse very much characterizes what I and other scholars, I've certainly seen Neil Price talk about this, is a kind of long slash discrete beginning for the Viking Age. It's not like a sudden, flick, like a bomb being dropped and suddenly everything changes. It's more of a set of social developments that occur quite slowly, sometimes suddenly. So there are a few kind of big moments that precipitate or precede rather the Viking Age. The 536 climate disaster is quite a big one that definitely affected not only the climate and geography and population density of Scandinavia, but if you kind of consider that from the kind of psychological historian point of view, mass movements of people, the abandonment of family settlements and communities that had long, deep heritages in certain areas, it would have had an effect on the mind and it would have restructured whatever administrative forms were already in Scandinavia in kind of the Roman and immediate post-Roman period. So it changes the way power is appreciated and organized. Much of this is kind of that slow Roman decline, or at least the transmutation of what people in Scandinavia appreciated as Roman. I think in Scandinavia, Roman kind of meant mercenary activity. We see this in the Marcomannic Wars, which, well before the Viking Age, and auxiliary forces hired as not true Romans, if you like, but kind of the guys that get the job done for the Romans. And then when everyone in the Roman Empire becomes a Roman citizen, that starts to bleed over the limes, the limits of the Roman Empire into Scandinavia. And you see a lot of Roman goods repurposed well into the 7th, 8th centuries in Scandinavia. So that kind of Roman heritage enforces quite a lot of the attitudes of the Viking Age. This whole belief um, in warriorhood, tied to seamanship and a kind of hierarchy of gods that are engaged in most of the same struggles that the mortal world was engaged in, like blood feuds, dynastic squabbling. It's all wrapped up through a kind of Roman lens into that aforementioned nebulous north. So a lot of this kind of musing on the discrete beginning of the Viking Age, a lot of it has to be inherently theoretical. They're not writing down, we love the Romans so much, and these are the elements of a Roman identity we're taking, and this is what we're going to do with it. It has to be kind of inferred through archaeological assemblages, grave goods, barrow mounds, distributions of place names, what have you. Um, but the kind of economic push for the Viking Age for me is a slightly different thing. It becomes connected to this kind of climatological and psychological origin of the Viking Age. But this kind of emerges from, like you mentioned earlier, Terry, of kind of social capital. This whole idea of warrior hoods and military groups, very tightly knit chieftains, if you like, and their underlings in Scandinavia. Eventually, there are so many of these petty kingdoms or polities that young men, and it's predominantly young men who are keen to rank up through the social ladder, they have no opportunities or fewer opportunities within Scandinavia to do battle with one another, to advance up these hierarchies. So they start to raid elsewhere, and the evidence would suggest initial raids, at least, were tuned eastwards to kind of Salme, the famous Salme burials along the Baltic and rivers and so on. But then the forms of portable wealth start to change. It moves to kind of slaves in the middle of the Viking Age, but certainly at the start, it's mostly portable wealth. And a lot of that starts through the development of the North Sea economy to become really concentrated in coastal monasteries in northern England, Atlantic Scotland, Ireland, and so on. So they naturally become undefended, or at least lightly defended, hotspots of wealth at the same time that people are being pushed out of Scandinavia socially, not based on kind of diminished farmland or anything. I know they were the theories of 40, 50 years ago. So it kind of is a perfect mix. And you do get this throughout history, these kind of lightning in a bottle moments where a number of initially unrelated points come together and they form something. And we only appreciate that, looking back retrospectively. So much like the Viking Age had a discrete, long, and very winding origin, that was also a long and winding answer to your question.
So the this long and winding beginning of the Viking Age, if I'm hearing correctly, I mean you're going back almost to just the what's the right word? I can't think of the right word. You're going all the way back to when Scandinavia became populated by Germanic tribes, almost, right? Because if you go back to Roman times, I mean, those population pressures that couldn't move south because of the Romans moved north and then displaced the existing population there to then create a proto, what we might call Viking culture, right? Because that's why their mythology is so interwoven with Germanic mythology and it's so similar is
Mm.
because it's actually a northward population movement, right? So you're kind of imagining that, the reason I mean this, I think this is a good track to go on, right? A new theoretical framework. The reason there is a Viking Age is because there were Vikings. They weren't there before. Romans pushed them up. They moved into Scandinavia and then came back, essentially, right? I mean, it's kind of I'm oversimplifying it, right, for our listeners, but that's if I'm hearing you correctly, that's kind of the idea is going as far back as just when Scandinavia populated, and that started the clock, right?
Well, we certainly have to go back. You're very right. I think the Western Roman Empire, here's the thing, is it was the West's biggest superpower at the time. And I know Roman historians and early medieval historians don't always talk to one another. That's kind of a shift in how things are studied at the moment, is we're having a very good push towards late antique historians, kind of bridging that gap and seeing a need for there not to be a gap. But I mean, to cut a story short, is even when it declined, the Western Empire left such a tangible legacy, not just across the territories that were considered part of that empire, but also immediately beyond, that it's less of a case of kind of here are Romans moving like a red arrow on a map, pushing other people up, but more ideology spreading through people of different linguistic groups up and down the Northern Way, in one case, into Sweden in another. Um, and what's interesting, I think, is in the early medieval period, there's certainly an abundance of literature that concerns itself with migrations and world-spanning adventures of people groups moving. One of my favorite examples is Paul the Deacon's History of the Langobards, which he wrote in the 8th century, deriving somewhat from a pre-existing text written by an anonymous author. And in this text, according to Paul, if you were to just read the facts straight, people called the Mad Dogs came from Scandinavia. They had a little foray or sojourn in North Germany for a bit. They had a chat with Odin, legendary battle with the Vandals, and then they moved into Italy and invaded it in 568. And that's a neat narrative that was popular to kind of learned audience of the 8th, moving forward a few more centuries. But um, studying kind of social history, it's never a case of neat migratory blocks moving and pushing another neat migratory block elsewhere. That's certainly how the subject is studied in the British education system in primary and secondary schools, so from kind of age 6 to 16, because it's a very easy way to teach the subject. But it does oversimplify, I think, to a detrimental degree at times. Because in the pre-Viking Age, it's less of a case of neat, ethnically defined groups that are migrating to specific locations with salient and hard and defined material cultures, but more of styles, fashion trends, prestige languages that are moving. And people are renegotiating their own identities with themselves, with others, in this kind of legacy of the Roman period. And that legacy was so pervasive. It becomes transmuted through the successors of the Romans in France and Germany, the Merovingians, who definitely had an impact on Scandinavia. These big pre-Viking Age structures that we see built in Denmark, such as the famous Dane Wall and forgot the name of it, the canal off an island off the coast of Jutland. It's just gone from my head. But
The
these
the da
monumental.
the Danaverka? Is that what you're
Yeah,
thinking of?
that's the wall, the Danaverki, you're right, the
Yeah.
Dane Wall. And then there's a canal that's built at the same time elsewhere. But these monumental constructions are big royal expenditures. And it appears to be kind of channeling a model of kingship that's based on maybe not wholly, but it's inspired by Merovingian big administrative frameworks, which are in turn communing with a Roman legacy. So it's a step-by-step process. It's not neat at all. It's very messy, and you've got all these people who have a different idea of what Roman means. And I think that is, if we're ever going to identify the start of the Viking Age, it has to be in the Roman period, in quite a large way, in my opinion. Soren Sindbeck's newest book, the name escapes me, but Soren Sindbeck's absolutely brilliant scholar. Or is it? It might be Dagfinn Skray who's published the new book. Both of those guys are absolutely fantastic. In many ways, they're leading the charge on kind of the early Viking Age, the social, economic, psychological networks that give us the start of raiding. I've name dropped so many scholars in today's podcast, and these are all the people who've inspired me. Their names are just whirling around in my head. These are my idols, basically, the celebrities who I'd love to meet one day.
Yeah, we talked to Soren last year,
Hmm.
and he was great. That was
Oh,
a
I bet.
interesting conversation. I mean, yeah, and he's definitely in the, sort of the silver, the urbanization, a lot of work at Reba,
Yeah,
and so, he's kind of in that vein of looking at the Viking Age. But I think you're right. It's like Dagfinn maybe is the new book that's like
it
the
is. It is.
earlier period, like what, 400 to 800 or something like that.
Yeah, because Soren's
Maybe.
currently doing the Trelleborg series, like a
Yeah.
book about each of the Trelleborg forts, which is, I mean, equally fascinating study. But you're right, I'm thinking of
Yeah.
Dagfinn Screen.
Yeah. 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 It's super interesting stuff. And I think, um, For me, it's like super cool because I always say to my students, if I wasn't a Viking specialist, I would be in the Roman world because I find it really interesting and intriguing. And there's obviously a lot of overlaps in the type of culture that, in some ways, anyways, that they would be. And so then to see the scholarship coming together, to getting these
Yeah.
things to meet.
We're all friends, really, historians, archaeologists of this, pre-Norman world at least. We should all be friends. We should all work together.
Yeah, because it hasn't always been that way in
No,
academia. It's always been, the little sort of silos and stuff, which is to me seems a little bit crazy. But
it can be counterintuitive, I think, to stick
yeah,
to one period without ever kind of taking a look at what's going on before and after, which is
yeah,
part of what this book does. I mean, speaking of symbols and communing with the Roman heritage, I mean, this guy appears before the Viking Age, and it's a very popular symbol in some form throughout the Viking Age. That's just an example
yeah,
of how what we would call a pre-Viking Age symbol is part of the lexicon of the time. Because the people at the time didn't think, we're in the Viking Age now, let's do away with everything before, let's get rid of the Vendel period stuff. No, we don't want that. We're in the Viking Age. It wouldn't have been neat or tidy.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, in bottle form, that long rambly answer is contained across numerous pages in the book, if I
I,
remember correctly.
I do think there is a while we can kind of blur the line a little bit for the so-called beginning of the Viking Age. I really like the paleontologist Jack Horner. He did a couple of TED Talks, and one of his TED Talks he talks about scientists like to name things, and I think
Yeah,
about
we
that, and I
do.
think historians like to delineate things,
Yeah,
right? And so we have this Anglo-centric 793 to 1066, and now there's also in our archaeology there's this push a couple of years ago to call it the late Scandinavian Iron Age, at about year 700 to about year 1100, about so kind of moving the delineation. But there was a moment where Scandinavia, or at least this common cultural boundary that we today call Scandinavia, and archaeologically there was a shared culture that was separate from, say, the Finns or the Abradites or the Franks. They had a moment, right? That I don't know that we could say in the seventh or sixth century they had, um, because there was a change in characteristic, not just in how they were interacting with the world outside of their cultural and linguistic boundary, but also how that world outside viewed them.
yeah,
And I think that's an important thing to note is, and so that it's, and that's why I really, one of my favorite propositions for why the Viking Age was a thing. And I think it's legitimate because historians who look at the Mongols will say, well, why did the Mongol Empire expand? Well, because somebody invented a stirrup. That's it. And with the stirrup is this new technology. They were able to conquer the world. It's like it's wild. And so the Viking longship, at some point, somewhere in the 8th century, somebody figured out how to put down a keel. They could put up an 800 square foot sail, and they could go somewhere. And so it's
yeah,
like a kid with a BB gun, right? What you gonna do with it? I'm gonna shoot a bird. That's what I'm gonna do with
yeah,
it. Why? Because I can.
yeah. I can now. I couldn't
Yeah.
previously.
Yeah, and so I think the beginning for me the beginning, that's why actually back to your affinity for the show Vikings, at the beginning of that show, it's literally that's what they do, right?
Yeah,
That's Floki is just like, look, we built this ship with all this wood that I can somehow see through the like it's like the weird mystical thing. I was like, okay, well,
yeah.
and then they're
The
like, well,
gods
what do
love me,
yeah,
Ragnar.
what do we do with the boat? We're going to go to England.
Well, I mean, the central conflict driving that first season of Vikings, I mean, it works as a TV show because it pits Ragnar as the outsider maverick figure, and the success of his voyage is derived from the fact no one else believes that there's land to the west.
Mhm.
So it brings together, fact in the sense, yes, the longship facilitated the Viking Age, and then it weaves it into essentially a saga. I mean, the show Vikings is makes for a decent saga. It kind of uses recognizable and real elements in a bastardized, very fun, very entertaining fashion. As long as it's kind of appreciated it like that, I think it's a good show. I mean, I like it.
But
Um,
I engaged with some material too because I think to your point where you said they're like, oh, we're gonna go where we don't believe that there's land to the west, which I saw there was something about some talk that you gave where you brought up um, this idea that there were Scandinavians in the British Isles much earlier. So when we
yeah,
look at Sutton Hoo, for example, and the helmet corresponds, they're not the same, but I mean they look similar to what you have going on in Sweden during the Vendel period.
Yeah.
So if you want to speak to that, there's kind of that presence, so they would have known, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely they would have known. What's interesting is, I mean, to frame it using the show Vikings, is that it establishes that it's the Scandinavians who don't know about England, where in actual history, it's completely the opposite. Like the North Sea was a nexus of economic connections in the Roman period and afterwards. It's not like knowledge ceased for 3 centuries and people rediscovered that there were countries near them. Not at all. There would have been folk memories, there would have been administrative documents, there would have been trade links that were there already. I mean, for Christ's sake, there were goods from Africa that were made, ivory bag rings that were created in Ethiopia in the 5th and 6th centuries, and they were shipped directly to Lincolnshire in the pre-Viking Age. That is a fantastic and fascinating historical fact. And these were shipped en masse. They're all over the cremation cemeteries at Scremby, for example, which is south of the city of Lincoln. And that's a massive intercontinental relay of tradespeople long before the Viking Age. So if we can accept that, I mean, the whole idea that there were Danes, Frisians, Nords, Swedes in England already, of course. In the 80s, a very, very reputable, important scholar, John Hines, wrote a thesis about comparing brooch typologies in northern England with those in Scandinavia. And he hypothesized that there was kind of direct Scandinavian migration to the north of England. The conversation now shifts to less of a migration and more just a general period of constant, mundane, everyday movement between England and Scandinavia for 3, 4, 5 centuries. I mean, if we want to put a time limit on this, we run into the exact same conundrum about when the Viking Age starts. Now we'd be talking about when does the North Sea Age start? You can't really say. I mean, it's there. It just is. The North Sea's been there for a very long time, before humans were, to some degree. Don't quote me on that. That's
Well, that's
outside my area of interest.
well, you spoke about Frisia, and I think that's really interesting too, because there's a study that came out. Gosh, it's got to be 10 years now. They were looking at whetstones that were traded. They were carved out of Norway, and then they were traded all over Europe,
Yeah,
as far
steel
south
technology.
as Normandy, Frisia,
Mm.
even as far south as Aquitaine. So there was a trade. There's some kind of connection there that I think now, like I said, I haven't read your book, but I think it was mentioned that it was in your book. So that connection with Frisia early on, and
Yeah, well,
they're
Asia massive for understanding the Viking Age. I think it was the focus of my undergrad dissertation. Dawn Hadley was the one who set me on that. So I came to her in my second year and was like, I want to write my dissertation on the Viking Age. I'd like to do it on the earlier Viking Age, an aspect that's not yet in popular scholarly thought, and that's when she just set me like a bloodhound, unleashed me into the Frisian marshlands, and says, "Yeah, have a look at Viking army evidence in there." So yeah, I mean that forms a massive part of the book. You're right. The Frisian connections pre-Viking Age, like you mentioned with the whetstones, but it's also there through similarities in language. Old Frisian has so many cognates with Old English, and to a lesser extent Old Norse, but they're all very similar Germanic languages. So the North Sea facilitated those linguistic links much the same as it did economic and socio-political links.
Yeah, because Claire told us that. I think it was on the podcast, or at least maybe it was in a conversation with me. I can't remember. But that she thought maybe at least in Ireland, right? Claire Downham talks about the fact that she thought in those, trading settlements there that Old Norse was basically the lingua franca. That
Yeah.
sort of get probably what ends up ultimately happening is a little bit of a what do they call that? Like pigeon type language, like this
Yeah,
new
yeah,
new
absolutely.
little dialect that's a mashup so that everyone can understand each other.
Trade talk, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah, right.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Frisia, love the chronicles in the 830s of the Saxon Dorstad, where
oh,
like
yeah,
subsequently, it's like, oh, the Northmen killed, burned, stole. Oh, the Northmen came and did it again, and then pretty soon it's like, and they came for their usual surprise attack.
yeah. I
It's
mean,
just like They get so used to it. It's like so
It's
terrible.
brilliant, the Dorestad stuff. I mean, a key scholar working on that specifically would be Kristen Koymans,
Yeah,
who's a
we had
little
him on the
blind.
podcast too.
Oh wow!
Mhm.
You know what? I never would have believed a few years ago that I'd be joining this kind of shared universe of Viking Age scholars. I mean, to even have my name mentioned, albeit tangentially, alongside Claire Downham, is massive.
And she was on twice, man.
She was.
Yeah,
Vikingology is where it's at.
seminal expert. Yeah, I mean, me and Claire Downham actually. Um, I mean, I'll use this podcast opportunity to open the field to anyone who also doubts the existence of an Eric Bloodaxe, because as far as I'm aware, from what I've read, Claire Downham and I are the only people who seem to be heavily doubting the existence of Eric Bloodaxe as he appears in most history books, and to a lesser extent, Harold Fairhair. I mean, these are two names. The names certainly have currency in the Viking Age and what came after. But whether or not the stories associated with Harold Fairhair, him marrying like 19 women up and down Norway, Eric Bloodaxe killing all his brothers and ruling over York with an iron fist, if we can tie them to individuals, I don't think so. I mean, for me, how they're written, how they're portrayed in the sagas, in skaldic verses, they may be real. There's real roots there, but they're probably legendary composites by the time we get anything substantial written about them. So it grinds my gears when you'll have a history book and it will mention as kind of certified fact that Harold Fairhair was king over Norway at the time, or Eric Bloodaxe was king in York at the time. There was an Eric of York, yeah, we have coins, but Eric Bloodaxe is a literary villain in almost pantomime style in Egil's saga.
Yeah.
Brilliant saga,
Yeah.
but it's a very, very different form of evidence to immediately apply to coins that just feature the same name. You can see why people come to these conclusions, absolutely. And, who am I to go against years of scholarship? But yeah, me and Claire Downham, I think, are aligned on that note specifically.
Well,
It lit me up inside when I read it in one of her books. I was like, yeah,
That's
you
like
just
Vikings, though. That's Ragnar, right? Because Ragnar
right.
is
yeah,
a
I,
composite of
I was
like
gonna
these.
say you just got a big boost to your argument because Michael
yeah.
Hirsch, the creator of Vikings, just teamed up with Amazon to create a series on Eric Bloodaxe. You know when Michael Hirsch picks his character that it's a fiction. I'm gonna say it nicely, a fiction.
Yeah.
Oh.
There was a
Actually, since
brilliant.
you're there in York, though, sorry to yeah, that this I show my students every single term. There is a little video that students from like the Old Norse linguistics, whatever department at the University of York were
Yeah.
engaged a few years ago. So they made a little video about like helping, particularly, I think the museum there, at the Viking Museum there, those people understand what Old Norse sounded like.
Uh-huh.
And they talk about, like providing some of the voiceover or whatever for some of the animatronics that are in the museum and everything. But then to give people, including my students, an example of, okay, this is maybe what it sounded like, they read from Hufvudløsen, this poem about Eric Bloodaxe. And
Yeah.
so, even the students at your own university are perpetuating the myth.
Well, I mean, it's everywhere in museums. Um, like for example, to paraphrase it, it'd be like Viking York ended when the Viking king Eric Bloodaxe died in 954. But it's no, I mean it's the same with the Viking Age. It's not like anyone woke up the day after 954 when Eric Bloodaxe was killed and was like, oh, guess we're in a Anglo-Scandinavian city now rather than a Viking one. Also, how can a city be Viking? That to me, I mean, a city is a metropolitan melting pot, especially York in the 10th century. It's not Viking. It's not homogeneously one word or for that fact, one ethnicity, or one identity.
Well, but I mean, and we're a ways into this podcast, but like the elephant in the room, Alex, as you well know, and I asked you about this when you were talking with Sean's group. It's like when you say the word Viking, what the hell is it you even mean? Is it capital V? Is it lowercase v? I've, got friends that say to be a Viking is just a side hustle in an otherwise warrior culture, which I actually agree with. I think that's, pretty much what it is. But the word Viking has become so big and so
Yeah.
everything, right? And then you've got, Alex Wolf's piece of like, let's just get rid of the word altogether because it confuses people and people don't really know what it means and people think it's an ethnicity and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's like a ball that's in the air right now, it feels like to me, of even like, all right, if you say Viking, who are you even talking about?
But I mean that Alex Wolf article is brilliant. That's another big influence on my own work.
Yeah.
Um, I think the thing with using the term Viking in my book, I tried to do something that I've never seen before in a history book about the Viking Age, which is to not use it at all. Throughout the book, I use the traditional old Icelandic terms, Vikinga,
Yeah.
and I apply it in the fashion that's similar to the earliest application. So it means kind of pirate or plural
Yeah.
pirates.
Yeah.
Um, it's never used to be like Viking women wore these brooches or Viking pins
Right.
looked like this. Viking craftsmanship was different to Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship because those things cannot be tied to ethnic markers or even job markers or legal markers, in my opinion. There are those who disagree, absolutely fine. I mean, engaging in these discussions is half the fun. Other than the title, because I think a book lives or dies on whether it has Viking written in the title, especially a book like this. Other than the title, yeah, the word Viking to use in the modern sense that we're so familiar with only appears in quotation marks, I think, at the start and end of the book. So it really, I did make an active effort to avoid it. At first, I didn't think it'd stick when I was writing the book. I did it at the start to see how long I could last without resorting to the catch-all term while discussing early medieval Scandinavia. And eventually I just forgot that I wasn't using it and I never used it. So some terms where it is applicable, we talk about like a great Viking army because there it's synonymous with raiding army or pirate army. And in the earliest attestations of Viking and the Old English cognate, that's more or less what it means. Sea rover or raider, bandit, brigand, pirate, various kind of terms. I mean, and you had people doing what you'd call traditional Viking activity very clearly at a site in East Anglia called Rendlesham, which the occupation layers begin in earnest in about the mid 6th century up to the 8th. It was inhabited for longer than that, but these are the kind of primary occupation layers. And what you've got there is hack silver bullion, clipped coins. Some have come from very, very far away, like Constantinople, and metalwork that's been chipped and probably melted down. So the assumption there is, if say a metal detectorist was to find that and all they knew was the Viking Age, they'd probably assume quite rightly this is a Viking army camp. This is the camp of a raiding army in the 9th century because very similar to the artifactual assemblages. But all of that stuff dates 6th, 7th centuries. Because there's nothing ethnic or geographically specific about going raiding, going Viking. It's just, our modern use of the term. And you can see I've got a woolly horned helmet behind me, which really aptly maybe contradicts me right now. Is that it's explicitly tied to Scandinavia. I mean, I think the first reference in my book is to, like the first bibliographical citation is to Sir Walter Scott, who
Mhm.
popularized the term Viking in literature, which has obviously exploded into our modern age.
Yeah.
In his eyes, you've got literary villains, you've got pirates, but pirates are specifically different from Saracens, which are basically pirates from the Arabic world, and then there's Vikings who are pirates from the northern world, the kind of
Mhm.
frostbitten. So they're all variations of the same thing, sea raiders.
Yep.
But if you were to go into the early medieval period, all the evidence suggests it's never, ever, ever used as an ethnic term, not once. It's applied to English, well, people from England, it's applied to people from Frisia, people from Scandinavia. And I think that it doesn't end the discussion, but it certainly puts a nail in the coffin of whether or not it's an ethnic term.
Yeah, I mean, and it's certainly also, even in the earliest attestations, as you mentioned, which is generally runic inscriptions and skaldic poetry, that there's also distinction. Well, there's like noun verb, right? Viking is
Yeah.
something you do. It's also the guy who's doing it.
Mm.
But then there's also sort of a distinction of when is it good, when is it bad, and in-group, out-group type stuff, right?
Yeah, like
You're gonna
all
like raid or do that kind of stuff to your fellow people in your community, bad. Doing it to
yeah.
other people over there, good.
But
You know?
it's like the difference between you say, I'm going out Viking with the lads later.
Right.
Whee! And
It's like
then
a
on
hobby.
the other hand, it's like people are going Viking.
Yeah.
You know, it's depends on the perspective, like all language. I mean,
Yeah.
the study of historical languages is so complex, and I have the utmost respect for place name experts and etymologists.
Yeah.
But I mean, even just a surface level attempt to understand historical linguistics adds so much to any sort of study of history, study of archaeology, because you can get into these nitty-gritty arguments, and it just changes the way you think about things. Um, you know, like I've said throughout this podcast, I like The Last Kingdom, I like the show Vikings, but the latter commits a cardinal sin of having these Scandinavian warlords and pirates say things like, "We're Viking, yeah," and they're using the word wrong, and they're using it also in a context that implies they all think they're Viking as like an ethnicity. It's just, so off the mark.
Oh, they think
To a
women go to
dangerous degree.
Valhalla. I mean, come on.
Yeah, well,
Like,
But hearkening back to your beloved Friesland,
yes,
that's the word Viking may not even be of Norse provenance, but
mm,
rather a loan word from the Frisian Wisingas or
yeah,
Visingas. So that gives you, I mean, that's just to give our listeners a sense of how ambiguous even the origin of the word Viking is and how tenuous it is. I mean, nobody really agrees on where it comes from. You hear the people go, "Well, it's from the word Vic," and it's like, well, okay, sure, good luck
no,
proving
yeah,
it.
no. There's just no way I think we'll ever know specifically. But the fact that there are a lot of pretty compelling answers from all different kind of corners of the North Sea, from Vic in Norway, from the word wick, from trading posts in England, perhaps. I mean, both of those answers lead to interesting discussions. I mean, the Old English linguistic element, ingas, is one of my favorites. You see it all across charters and chronicles when we're talking about these obscure, very small territories in England. Um, so yeah, like you said, the old Frisian word, people who raid, people who trade, people whose lives kind of depend more or less on the sea, specifically the North Sea, maybe slightly east, you got the Baltic Sea, slightly west, English Channel and Irish Sea. Um, but if you were to look at, say, writers, all based on the continent mind, in the 5th century and slightly later in the 6th, who are talking about uh, seafaring dangers of their day, they're not using the term Viking or its cognates. They're talking specifically about kind of generic labels like Frankie, like Saxon. But what they're talking about in regards to the activity of these people is raiding. It's implied to be kind of camping on islands and hoarding wealth and attacking sailors. And if you were to just kind of cut and paste those entries, replace the word Saxon with Viking, and then, paste it into the 9th century, you wouldn't even bat an eyelid if you'd not read, say, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle before. You'd just be like, oh yeah, same old. Yeah. Yeah, but it's the fact that they appear before the Viking Age that raises eyebrows. It makes one think, hmm. And then it reshapes how you think about the onset of raiding. Was it so ubiquitous beforehand that it's just not really mentioned?
yep.
Um,
Mhm.
That's what
I
I
mean,
have.
and on that note, the kind of Saxon violence thing, it's not a cause of the Western Empire's decline, it's a consequence of. It's wrapped up in all of the kind of slow withdrawal and fracturing of that whole business.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like that. I think I've brought this up on the show before with some other folks. The Franks were, I mean, the first we talk a lot about. I mean, in modern history, we think of when you say the Atlantic Wall, you think of the Germans who built the bunkers all along the coast of
Yeah.
France. But there was a first Atlantic Wall, which was Roman fortifications all along the coast of what's now Normandy, Brittany,
Mm.
and it was explicitly created to fend off pirates, who were the Franks. who actually were established in your beloved Friesland, or the equivalent thereof, back in the, I think,
Yeah,
fifth and sixth centuries. So we have this phenomenon where pirates from the north are attacking the exact same areas that then, to your point, fast forward a couple of centuries and you replace with the word Viking. It's the same activity.
it is. Yeah,
Wild to
but
think.
it's on a bigger scale in the Viking Age, and I think, like you mentioned, with the development of longships, there are those different factors that kind of make raiding a lot more socially attractive to. I always use the term kind of up and coming violent young men in the late 8th, early ninth century. It's a continuation of raiding that's probably happening beforehand, or certainly happening beforehand in certain areas, but it's on a much bigger scale. I mean, I think that's the key shift if we're to identify the origin of the Viking Age.
Hmm.
It's not sudden activity, it's
Yeah.
Right.
increase in activity that's already happening.
Yeah.
That's
Because
Slow
the
increase.
yeah, that is the yeah, that's one of my main hypotheses about this, what I call the Walter White theory. Do you know who Walter White is?
Oh, how could I not?
Okay,
Brilliant.
so I'll send you this piece that I wrote because it's actually the genesis for the dissertation I'm working on now. So it's not out there anywhere,
When
but 'cause
did
I'm
Walt become Heisenberg? That
revising.
kind of thing.
But yeah, I mean, it's this whole idea of like for people who maybe don't know, there was this television show, very famous television show called Breaking Bad. And the main character is a man named Walter White, who is a high school chemistry teacher who finds out he has terminal cancer. And so he wants to like sort of set his family up so that they're okay after he dies. And he does that by taking his knowledge of chemistry and starting to manufacture meth and sell drugs, and then gets, over the course of 6 seasons, really absorbed into this, sort of criminal underground world of illicit drug activity. But at the end, I mean, it starts out in this innocent way, right? But then, and then in this small scale kind of way. By the end, I mean, he becomes like this monster and this very, important character in this world, who's successful at what he does. And then when he finally gets caught, right, and the whole thing kind of falls apart, and there's this like great scene where he says, they're like, well, why did you do it? And he's like, I did it because I found that I liked it, that I was good at it, and effectively it just says, I did it because I could. And that to me is the Viking Age. They start
Hmm.
in this smaller scale way, it ramps up, they become really good at it, it becomes a really interesting enterprise in every single way. They affect politics, they affect society, they affect the economy. They force other leaders to have to deal with them because they're powerful enough. And then, and it's like, and the whole point is because they could do it. Just they
Yeah,
figured out ways to do
absolutely.
it. The competition in that type of martial society early on, that is the seed bed for creating technological innovation like the ship and all of that. It all just lines up for them to create this thing that they're very successful at, and they do it because they can. Yeah.
I mean, that's a superb, what you've just done there is a superb example of how you take something embedded in popular consciousness, Breaking Bad, one of the best TV shows ever.
Yeah.
Most people will have heard of it, and you use it to explain something that's very, very complicated. I mean, that is a perfect way of teaching, in my opinion. Tried to do similar using different pop cultural analogies in across my works. Um, just off the top of my head, when people love to argue about, say, when Walter White became Heisenberg, or other films entirely. How many people at the end of The Thing, 1982, John Carpenter, are human? Is
Yeah.
Kurt Russell human, or is he the Thing? Um, because both blokes at the end, you don't know who's who.
Yeah.
And these debates that percolate around that film must be similar to all the varying, contrasting, and contradictory interpretations of certain Norse mythological figures. There was never a handbook that said Odin is always depicted this way. You can imagine quite easily arguments in the Viking Age between people over their different opinions or different interpretations of the same deific figures. Much the same way we debate about our pop culture today, there was also an early medieval pop culture. Um, so yeah, it's just brilliant. there will never not be new ways to talk about history, let alone just the Viking Age.
Yeah.
Inspiration comes from anywhere.
Yeah.
Um, to say, I suppose, to mirror what you said about Heisenberg, another show that inspired Breaking Bad, I would say smidgen better is The Sopranos, HBO's The Sopranos. Monumental masterpiece of filmmaking. And you watch Breaking Bad and you think, how much did Walter White change over the course of the show? Maybe not, we can't identify when he changed, but he clearly did change, and how much did he evolve? With The Sopranos, it's almost a case of how little does Tony Soprano change? Because throughout the show, and there's no spoilers here, a common framing device for each episode is his therapy meetings
Right. Right.
with his therapist. And he goes into his backstory, his trauma, how he feels about himself and his family. And nothing really changes. In some ways, you could argue. He more or less just beds down into the mobster lifestyle, which he was already in at the start of the show. And it doesn't mean the show is less interesting than Breaking Bad because it's doing a similar thing just from a different angle.
Yeah.
So it's like with the Viking Age and the raiding beforehand. How did it not change? I mean, it's we can sit and talk here about all the changes and evolutions that preceded the Viking Age, and we could also sit here and argue just as much about, I think, what's similar before the Viking Age and what doesn't change moving into it. And I mean, I suppose it all comes down to this whole idea that we imagine there must be sudden changes because we're so used to seeing timelines with different coloured blocks of history. The red Roman period, then the purple Dark Ages, and then the blue Viking Ages. And we just imagine that there must be a different aesthetic moving through those periods. It's say if you had a TARDIS or a time machine.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. Going back to the Franks, who raided first, and then the Scandinavians did a few centuries later. One might make the case based on that logic, and correct me if I'm off base here, but one might make the case of what we're dealing with is just two different time spans where people in general, similarly geographic areas who are generally loosely related are dealing with the same subset of problems that haven't changed, and the response is identical. So how much have they not changed? It's almost a rebuke to the Viking Age. Instead of saying, "Oh, they created this new technology and then they did all these amazing things," actually, really, it was the result of them not being able to adapt to the problems that led to the Franks
Hmm.
raiding in the West in the first place. It's a failure of evolution of their society rather than the product of some kind of new evolution.
Well, I mean, that's brilliant. I mean, the microcosm timeline of the Viking Age that's perhaps so prevalent now in pop culture and mainstream books is the uptick in raiding, the consolidation of raiding, and how farms and the slave trade became designed around the creation of ships to steal people to make money. And then that forms nation states. That's kind of the simplified three-act timeline of the Viking Age in Scandinavia. After 1066, you see that play out on a macro level in the Baltic Sea, where you have suddenly Baltic Lithuanians, Curonians, Latvians, Estonians, Karelians, Finns, all number of kind of specific geographic groups that are mentioned by chroniclers of the time. Undoubtedly, it was messier than that. And they start to go Viking against Scandinavian areas. So they're raiding the stave churches instead of Northumbrian monasteries. And then they start to get pushed back. There's a little bit of a amplification of raiding. There's references of kind of Scandinavian ships or sailors that are shipwrecked in pagan lands and they have to deal with raiders. Convoys are attacked and so on. And then eventually, much like what happened with Scandinavia, many of these Baltic lands consolidate into what we'd recognize today as kind of a medieval kingdom or a duchy or a principality. So, like you say, it's similar, perhaps not identical, but very similar sets of social circumstances, economic ones, um, religious and psychological ones, and technological factors that combine to form
Yep.
what you might call a kind of generic Viking push. And we get this Viking push in different areas of the world sequentially at different times. And the big one is, of course, Scandinavia,
Yep.
because that's so embedded in pop culture. But there were undoubtedly these similar circumstances happening before and after
Yeah.
until there were no more spots to go Viking left on the map. And that's the kind of the line I come to towards the end of my book. And I try to wrap it up in a kind of poetic, cosmological way, mirroring some of the nine realms and the Ragnarok myth, because I thought that would be entertaining.
Mhm.
All right. Well, that seems like a good way to end, because people need to now go out and get your book. But I
Yeah,
mean, what are we all like an hour and a half or something already? We could keep talking forever.
yeah, I'm sure.
I mean, I think it would be great to have you back on. I would like to have some discussion specific more to archaeology, and such. If
Yeah,
you'd
absolutely.
be
Be my
okay with
pleasure.
that, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
But this has been great, a really interesting conversation. And like my mind is like, "Rah," because I'm so immersed in this research right now. And so all of these things
Yeah.
are really yeah, in my mind. So
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. This was fun.
yeah.
I knew it'd be a good discussion when I saw, oh, he's talking about the beginning of the Viking Age. That's something we really like to talk about.
Where it's at, man. It's where all the action is.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for
Yeah.
having me. I mean, this has been brilliant. It's been intellectually stimulating. It's been fun. I didn't think Breaking Bad would be mentioned, and it was one of my favorite shows. So, I'm happy.
We'll have to talk about that more.
Yeah.
All right.